Good morning, comrades. You are listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning, Comrade. Jeff, and we have a very special guest because Robert's on wife guide duty. Actually, he told me today that Erin, his wife, is actually on. It's her birthday today, and they're going out to dinner. So didn't want to mess that up for him. But we instead of Robert, we have a very, very special guest. We have Corinne Green joining us. Hi, say hi to people, Corinne.
Hey people, comrades, this is Corinne Green, coming to you live from the best city in the world and the best state in the country, New Orleans, Louisiana.
Just some people that might not know, just would you mind introducing yourself and maybe talk about some of the work that you do and have done and are doing and might do in the future? And
yeah, so I am born and raised from here in New Orleans, and I have been doing trans activism in Louisiana and around the country for over a decade. I got my start with Equality Louisiana, if you remember those old heads, and Louisiana Trans Advocates back in the day. And then moved out of state for a while to do policy for Transgender Law Center. And then after that, I did policy for Equality Federation, which is a national organization that supports the state LGBTQ groups. And they were an all work remotely organization. So as soon as I could, I moved back here to New Orleans.
Came back home.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I primarily focus on, and I'm really proud of, is, here in Louisiana, I cannot do, I can't pass the California Gender Recognition Act like I did in California here in Louisiana, right? And so when I was the head of Louisiana Trans Advocates, we actually drafted and passed the first ever, enacted law in Louisiana Trans Advocates history, which was in 2016, we decriminalized Narcan, naloxone, here in the state. And so I really try to find proactive ways to do policy in service of our community. And here in the South, that means really thinking broadly about what is the queer issue, what is connected, what are all these intersections, and working coalitionally. You know that because you'd organize in the South.
Right. So I just actually wanted to touch on the Narcan thing because, a lot of people might not think like, oh, Narcan, that's a queer issue or anything like that. But, obviously these things cross over. Can you talk a little bit about how that overlaps? I think it's really important to get into.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you look at the data, and queer people and trans people especially are overrepresented in most of the horrifying sounding statistics you can find, right? And so one of those things is overdose deaths. And so, I'd finally met some like badass harm reductionists who at the time had founded Tri-Stereo, the Needle Exchange in New Orleans. Another friend of mine founded No Overdose Baton Rouge in Baton Rouge. And so this was either late 2015 or early 2016, right after Bobby Jindal had kind of landed his final abortion attack here. And so there were some kind of meetings springing up around the state around what people could do. And so that's where I first came across my harm reduction comrades, and it blew my mind the stuff that they were doing kind of underground, right? And the impact that they were making. And so we linked up with some folks who were able to give us the New Orleans geographical overdose data, so the distribution of overdose deaths and response incidents around the city. And so with Tri-Stereo, what we wanted to do is to go into those parts of the city and work with, bar owners, convenience store owners, drugstore owners, to see if they'd be willing to keep Narcan behind the counter, because those are the places where people were overdosing outside or sometimes in the bathrooms there, and nobody would do it because at the time Narcan was not legal for lay people just to have and distribute and administer.
Yeah, it was just cops that had Narcan.
Right. Yeah. If you were lucky, even then,
yeah.
they didn't necessarily. And so
cops know how to use it. That don't hurt people. That's not you can't kill anybody with Narcan.
Oh my, yeah. As a lobbyist, I cannot tell you how much pain I'm in when I'm doing harm reduction work, and I have to tell people we're doing this to reduce needle stick injuries for cops or whatever. Right? It's like, yeah, okay. Right. Yeah. But yeah, so we had this program that we thought would really help people, but we couldn't get any of the legitimate business people on board with it, even though it was something that they really would help the communities that were based in. And so since at that time I'd already been doing policy for LTA, Louisiana Trans Advocates, and Equality Louisiana, but I'd only really worked on bills other people had filed that I had opinions on and worked on those, or the legislation that we'd been running traditionally, which is our Employment and Non-Discrimination Act, which is on like the 40-year plan to passage. It's on its like 20th or 30th anniversary this year. I forget which one. So
anniversary, I guess.
Yeah, right. And so I had just enough kind of policy knowledge and confidence to be like, well, let me just look this up and see why we can't do it, why this is illegal. And so I looked it up, and I was like, well, it would just take one sentence. If this one sentence were different, this would all be fine. And so I was like, well, nobody's told me that I can't just write that one sentence and then find a representative to introduce it as legislation and then get it passed into law. Which is
a bunch of like people standing around as like, what do we do?
I mean, that's really kind of what it was, right? And so I wrote the sentence, and I contacted Helena Moreno, who was representative at the time, now on New Orleans City Council. She agreed to run it for me, and we got it passed pretty easily. And so since then, I've been kind of slowly chipping away at improving Louisiana harm reduction laws. But one of my favorite parts of that story is, when you're doing policy work, when you're doing legislative work, you want to present, a full package to a legislator to tempt them to run your thing, right? So I managed the whole thing from the comm side to like the grassroots lobbying side to organizing the testimony and all that stuff. And so one of the folks that I had come do the testimony for the bill at the Capitol was a non-binary anarchist who they're badass as hell, love them. But at the time, Tristereo folks who tend to be more anarchist than communist were a little distrustful of me because they saw me interacting with state power, right? Including this non-binary anarchist who's a friend of mine. But through the process of showing up at the legislature, when I begged them to, delivering their because they were an EMT at the time, their medical professional testimony in favor of it and stuff. And then we got it passed into law, and then they're like, Corinne, wait, you can use state power for good? And I was like, hell yeah, buddy, we just did. And
you really have to, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt, but like you have to. Like, if you don't, like you are so screwed. I think that's like one of the really important points that like I wanted to get from this conversation with you. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I really wanted to point on that.
Yeah, and so the end of that story is, so eventually they went to medical school in Florida, and because of their experience here, they were, they came to the same conclusion that you just enunciated, and were like, oh, not only can you use state power for good, but now I have seen it happen and I know how to do it. And so in Florida, while they were at medical school, they actually passed the syringe exchange legalization law in Florida. Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know there was syringe exchanges in Florida. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, like, especially considering a lot of this. So that is another thing too. Maybe we'll circle back to the like ability to get like some. I mean, we're gonna talk about it, like ability to get something that can actually help people happening in all of the giant, massive hellscape that is taking place within like a lot of these like quote unquote red states that are governed by supermajority Republicans and these tyrannical, monstrous governors and all these other things. But like, I do want to like if you like, I want to say this, and I think it's like super important to like put out there as we kind of like launch this conversation is, if you abandon if the good guys, if the the people who actually care about human beings and don't want to like only like fill the pockets of oil and gas and like all the most evil people on earth. If you abandon the sort of like arena of like pushing for any kind of state policy or state policy, federal policy, municipal policy, whatever, like those evil people that you want to like that are like killing us are going to take it over and use that mechanism to destroy us. Like, I don't mean to put it like that apocalyptic terms, but it is.
But that's how apocalyptic it is. Yeah.
Yes, it really is. I'm not trying to be like just like, waving my hands and say like the sky is falling like Chicken Little or whatever. But that's literally what happens. All the time.
It is. And I see a lot of people get into, their theory arguments or whatever, and like master's tools, master's house or stuff. Sorry about that. And
okay.
And I, coming at it from harm reduction, I think has made it just makes it a much simpler calculus, right? It's like, yes, I'm doing everything I can with my comrades to build for the future we want and deserve, and also people I love and the community and my neighbors are dying and hurting right now around me, and there's something I can do to affect that as well. Mm-hmm. And so one of my hobby horses really, I'm not an attorney. I have degrees from LSU, but they're in French and like international studies, right? So policy work, policy work is intentionally mystified, right? There's intentionally it's intentionally obfuscated. So people think, oh, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a legislator, that's not for me. And they do that on purpose to keep people out of it. But it's relatively accessible once you get over that hump.
Yeah. It's not that complicated. If you understand the flowery language, you can like see it. Like it's not that complicated.
Yeah.
Like,
and even the flowery language is not like it looks intimidating, but I promise you, your own legislators do not understand it more than you do. If you can read English,
and once you see the flowery language, you see it over and over and over again. You're like, that's just a bunch of BS. Who cares?
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, so and again, so I wanted to have you on the that's really long wind up to talk about why we wanted to talk. I want to talk with you because we mentioned earlier the state of Louisiana, like the Jeff Landry plus the supermajority of Republicans, the absolute like. It would be funny how much of a laughingstock the Democrats were in the state if the implications or the knock-on effects of that weren't so horrible. And also, in addition to that, not only are they like, inept or whatever, but like they're inept on purpose. And also, some of the Democrats in this state, like Katrina Jackson, who comes up to mind, like over and over again on these kinds of like, especially quote unquote social issues or whatever that they would be determined like mainstream press. She's like one of the ones that are pushing for some of these anti-trans legislations and outlawing abortion and all these other things, and she's hiding behind Jesus and the fact that she's a unicorn black woman from Monroe or whatever. And it's like, that doesn't give you license to do evil stuff. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think for a lot of people, they see, they're in it for the money, basically, right? Mm-hmm. Politics is a great way to make money, and if you get into it without core values guiding you, then you just you follow whatever wherever the money's at, and the money is very firmly in the fascist camp.
Yeah, very firmly. So I guess just to sort of like, could you just sort of lay out, at least to some extent, some of the landscape of what's going on within the most recent session of the Louisiana Legislature? Is it still ongoing?
So we just sine died a couple days ago.
Okay.
And so sine die is the obfuscation term for ending the legislative session. I'm sorry I used
it's all Latin to me.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So they accomplished a whole lot of terrible stuff this regular session, coming on the heels of the special session we had earlier in the year on crime, which was really, really rough because I was part of the Youth Justice Coalition that had passed that initial round of kind of youth justice reforms several years back here in Louisiana. And so one of the things that they've been doing since then has been kind of slowly undoing a lot of the like progressive reforms that we pushed through, several years ago. So one of the things
what kinds of reforms?
Yeah, so one of the big ones is they rolled back again the age at which you can be prosecuted as an adult to 17. And that was a huge fight for us to like it was a huge raise the age campaign, and there were a lot of states were working on it at the time that we were here, and so they've been chipping away at this stuff ever since then. I think they also made some terrible modifications to our conditions of confinement for youth confinement legislation as part of that package as well. And actually, you've kind of seen the sheriffs push back a little bit now, because now that they've redone these laws, and they're going to have to theoretically house youths in the adult jails and prisons, some of the sheriffs have been like, we actually don't want the liability of having these youth in here. It's not, and I don't blame them. Right. So.
Yeah, and so I guess that's a couple of the sort of like the key wins, and then there was also like, I know there's a lot of talk about the constitutional convention and all this other wild stuff, and just like what else is going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, the Constitutional Convention, if you paid attention to the elections here in Louisiana, Jeff Landry and nobody talked about the Constitutional Convention on the campaign trail. Nobody talked about it at the very beginning of the year. The only people who were talking about rewriting the Louisiana Constitution were the law dorks like me, who have to spend a few extra minutes every now and then going back and forth between where things are in law and where things are in the Constitution, because we have kind of a Swiss cheese approach. That's here in Louisiana, we're constantly voting on adding things into the Constitution, just because of one of the ways that it was set up back in, I think it was 74, I guess was our current one with Edwin Edwards, and so not a single time have they said, after Jeff Landry got elected and decided that he was going to try to rush a constitutional convention during his first year as governor, they still had not ever, I believe to this day, revealed what they actually want to do it for. Why?
It's a big old surprise. It's a surprise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Luckily, that has been rebuffed, at least for now, but I have heard some potential that there could be a special session just to pass legislation calling a constitutional convention. All right. But we know that they will do a whole lot of damage if they're able to do that. Jeff Landry released his list of who was going to be, who were his picks for that. And,
his draft of
it was just horrific.
His fantasy draft of like Constitution drawers uppers.
Yeah. Like I think Gene Mills from Family Forum was in there, and then there was like the head of the Cajun Contractors of Louisiana. It's like, I'm sure that guy has great policy thoughts. Cool. But obviously they don't need a constitutional convention to do a whole lot of damage, and they have done a whole lot of damage this session. So some of the issues that they've really, really pounded hard on are empowering police. They passed laws, to give a whole lot more deference to people in cars who decide they want to drive through protests. There's this, you probably heard of this one, the absurd law that you have to remain more than 25 feet away from cops while they're doing their jobs. And then the abortion attacks and the anti-queer stuff has been horrific, right? We're the first state in the country, and hopefully the last. But typically the way this stuff works is once the seal is breached, everybody's chomping at the bit to do this stuff. The first state in the country to add mifepristone and misoprostol. So these are two drugs that are used in childbirth, in miscarriage management, and inducing labor, and then also for self-managed medication abortion. Adding those two drugs to the State Controlled Substances Act on Schedule 4, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah, and so not only does that have a whole lot of knock-on effects in the medical system, right? Because controlled substances are tracked through the prescription monitoring program, the PMP, and there are a whole lot more restrictions on who can prescribe them. So prescribers who could have prescribed these before will have to obtain a certification to continue issuing them. Hospitals have to keep track of them. And then also state agencies like the Board of Pharmacy, the Board of Medicine. And one project I'm working on right now is trying to actually map out what all of the state agencies are that have automatic inherent access to that PMP, so we know which state officials will just be able to pull up and just see straight up who is accessing this medication in the state, which is terrifying when you've got Landry and Morrill at the top of the state, right? But then the other thing that it does is we know that in Louisiana, our infrastructure is abysmal. Our healthcare system has been failing us for a long time, since even before Katrina. And so community and mutual aid is a pretty significant part of many people's healthcare access needs here in Louisiana. And so there are people who do, I'm going to be have to be very careful kind of how I speak here, but there are people who do the mutual aid work of practical support, making sure that people who need healthcare resources but are not plugged into the system as much as they need to be or wish they were, are still able to access those resources. And the way that this law is written, my understanding is that for each pill, you can get charged separately, right? And so for each one, it's like 5 to 10 years or something. So very quickly, if you are working in that kind of community support role, very quickly you could be facing, potentially life in prison for doing mutual aid work that until this year, or until, I forget, maybe August 1st is, I think, possibly when it goes into effect. Don't quote me on that though.
But like it's important to focus on the fact that it's hair raising that like you can get. People are going to seek medical care for their medical issues, no matter what. It goes back. I mean, it's something that people will do what they have to survive. And like the thing that is doing is like all you're doing when you're making these things illegal is you're criminalizing healthcare. You're essentially making it so that when people do the things that are necessary to take care of themselves, you are literally making that an illegal act, right, and essentially threatening to throw people in prison for that. Yeah. It comes from everything from abortion to gender affirming care or whatever it is. And I think that's really an important point to always keep driving home on this particular thing, is that like if you criminalize, specifically some of these drugs, like abortions are not going to go away. They're just become more dangerous. Gender affirming care is not going to go away. It's going to become more dangerous. And you're essentially moving those kinds of acts and, folks to the social margins to a certain extent because of that criminal. And it's literally just a case of cruelty for the sake of cruelty. And I can't, I'm sorry. It makes me so furious and so upset.
No, I mean, there's a whole host of horrific effects to this that are even beyond kind of the obvious direct implications, right? So the way that a lot of this community-run infrastructure, like abortion funds, are funded, right? Like at this point, a lot of their funding comes from donations, but a lot still now at this point comes from kind of foundations and institutional funders and stuff, right? And what folks don't understand is that as these areas become more and more criminalized to work in, all of those very conservative foundations that took 30 or 40 years or whatever to get comfortable funding this kind of work, they pull back. Because there are a whole lot of restrictions that come attached to the traditional funding model trying to do, nonprofit advocacy work under capitalism. And it is just from the harm reduction context. You might be running a needle exchange and you'll get a grant for $10,000 and they'll tell you, okay, but this can't be used for syringes or needles. And you're like, well, it's one of my largest. Okay, cool.
So what is it for?
Right, yeah. And so kind of the whole system, which is already in real bad shape, is just kind of the ramifications are enormous and wide-ranging, I'll say.
Yeah. And, you mentioned, some of the community mutual aid and some of the things like that. Like, who are obviously sensitivity for the, clandestine activities, I suppose. But, like, who are some of the people that are not only, like, leading some of that stuff and doing really good work, but also we can maybe get into some of the people who are doing the good work also in the legislature as well.
Yeah, so the groups that are doing that kind of work here, I'm not as educated as I should be around North Louisiana, but in Southeast Louisiana, Gulf South Plan B actually handles a lot of Plan B, which is different from MIF and mifepristone and misoprostol, the drugs that were criminalized. And they will actually ship around the Gulf South for anybody who needs Plan B in a hurry. There's REJAC in New Orleans, REJAC. And then the organization that started as New Orleans Abortion Fund is now Louisiana Abortion Fund, and they're doing that kind of work. And on the harm reduction end, we've got Tri-Stereo in New Orleans. And then I do know of the Philadelphia Center in Shreveport, who are the people that I have worked with on some initiatives, some harm reduction initiatives up there. And we've got some kind of scrappier groups in Lafayette and Lake Charles that I'm not sure have formal names, or if they do, I've forgotten them, and I'm doing them a huge disservice right now. But
sure, but there's people active. I think what's important to sort of focus on is that there are people that are active across the state. If people did need to kind of get support, is there like a place or like a person that, or a website or whatever to get them in touch with that kind of thing, or is that something?
Yeah, so I would send folks to Gulf South Plan B. I think it's .org. I'm bad at that. Sorry. But yeah, Gulf South Plan B is where I would start for kind of to get plugged in if you need repro resources. And then Tri-Stereo Harm Reduction New Orleans if you need more harm reduction side resources. And then if you are a trans youth or are family or friends with a trans youth, I'd encourage you to get in contact with Campaign for Southern Equality, which is, I think, probably the only pseudo-national, they're regional, queer organization that I'm actually happy with at this point in time. Because they have been able to take the lead and kind of spin up a practical support infrastructure in a way that I was worried it would take the movement a really long time to do, because it took the abortion and repro movement a long time to kind of work through its growing pains to get to the point where it has even the practical support infrastructure that they have now. And one of the things that I was focusing on before Equality Federation and I parted ways was trying to figure out how to bootstrap the queer movement into that place where Southern trans people need them to be without having to go through that long and painful process that the abortion movement went through.
What do you mean by that?
So kind of all of the things that we've talked about as being impediments or structural challenges have been, we know about them because people face them and work through them, right? So those funding challenges in gray areas, those how to reach community when the service that you are providing might not be illegal, but is being surveilled heavily or is being violently challenged in the streets by clinic watchers or whatever. And so those are all things that the repro folks have worked through for us, and it has
paved the road, literally.
Yeah. And so because we know in the South all of these things have always been linked, and one of the things that I'm most proud of in the South is how coalitional and intersectional and cross-issue and broad-based our organizing is. I've worked all around the country, and I've never seen anything like Southern organizing. I love it. And so I want us to be able to use those lessons and those connections to be able to provide that same kind of framework of support for trans youth, trans people and their families, without having to go through the really lengthy period of all of these organizations that have mainly just done policy advocacy, and in a large part, and especially in the South, mostly just done kind of defense on policy advocacy. It is a significant change to retool for practical support, for direct services, for kind of with security infrastructure that befits kind of healthcare. And so all of these things are lessons that people, our ancestors and have come before us and learned and figured out ways to work around it. I'm not, I don't think anybody would claim that, the repro movement is in a great place right now in this country, but they have learned some really hard lessons and can teach them to the rest of us.
Yeah, no, 100%. You're listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. Corinne Green joining us on the show. And yeah, so that's a really sort of interesting concept, sort of having a movement, or a movement is probably like an overused word, but sort of like a structures that sort of run the gamut of necessary support, mutual aid that sort of runs from that all the way through to the policy side of things. That's a really sort of like, I mean, it's an interesting and it's a really important and necessary I guess angle by which that this has to be approached. It doesn't seem like it's gonna be something that's like super easy to construct, but it's like it's definitely like got to be put together. Like you gotta put together.
and one like I it's really interesting to me the way you phrase that, right? Because the way you phrase that is really indicative of the way that a lot of people see kind of the spectrum of activism work, right? So you kind of went, and I'm not criticizing you at all. You went kind of from like grassroots direct services on one end and then policy advocacy on the other end. And I think that is, insightful in that is how people see this stuff. Is that they see, right? There's a prestige
it's always been
associated with policy advocacy, and there's a stigma associated with like direct services, grassroots practical support. And that is also represented in how people are compensated or not compensated for doing those kinds of work. But one of the things that I love about doing work in the South particularly is that like those tend to be the same people doing like that whole spectrum of work, right? Like that first bill that my first ever bill drafted into law that I wrote with my own hand and put in the revised statutes, that came because we were working as Tristereo to try to get Narcan out into the community, and we ran into a roadblock, and all these anarchists were like, oh well, I guess we can't do it. I was like, well, I know just enough to get myself into trouble here. Let me take a look, right? And so that kind of, because there's no money here for any of it, it does tend to just be the same people who see need and jump to fill it.
Yeah, no, totally, and it's again in part it's a labor of necessity, and it's the people that are like heading up this work do it not because there's a lot of money in it, even on the policy side necessarily, but like because it's something that they actually do care about, and it's something that like that is at least the bad guys have all the money. They really actually don't give a crap about any of this stuff. They're doing it to create confusion and the disarray the other side, or whatever it is. Like, and I'm not trying to like humanize the most evil people on earth. They're horrible, but like,
all they have is money, basically.
Yeah, they got no. I mean, I guess they have to some extent strategy, but like they have the ability to execute things because they have power here. But like they have a weak chin essentially.
Yeah, so when I worked for Equality Federation, I was one of the things I did for them was frontline bill tracking for all 50 states in the country, right? So I was one of the first people to, I have these hoppers with key terms, key phrases that I look for, and I go through the hoppers every day and see what we caught, right? And see if it's relevant or not relevant. And
like
so,
pull up crab traps.
And so I guess basically, when you read 10,000 bills a year from all around the country, your brain kind of turns into a mush of an LLM or something, right? And so you identify the similarities, and you're like, oh, this bill is the exact same as this one. I saw this one 2 weeks ago for the first time in my life in South Carolina, and now here it is in Missouri, right? You see these things spread, but you also develop kind of a sense of who is writing these things. You can tell when you read that much legislation whether it was written by like an ALEC, where they have actual people who are horrible people but do know how to write policy.
Professional horrible people.
When it's like a legislator just writing stuff out the dome, or when it's a legislator dictating to House Legislative Services, like, here's the bill I want, write it for me, and then House Legislative Service. Like, you can tell those things apart. And you should get involved with policy work, because I can promise you that you know more about policy than your representative or senator. Anybody listening, I can tell you right now, you would do as well, if not much, much better than whoever represents you in your legislature right now.
Yeah, that is like what. That's one of the things that I've learned, like either going in the Capitol like myself, or like doing it for like I was a member of the teachers union for years, and we would go do that, and like, I don't know, like literally we would go and like send notes to the people that are on the floor, and then sometimes about, and like you can tell they're just operating on vibes, like,
Well,
or like they have,
and you can tell when they're operating on some higher orders other than vibes too. So a few weeks ago, our HB 608, which is the worst anti-trans bill of the session here in Louisiana, and it is I call it, when I categorize and track these bills, I call it a sex definition bill, because the primary thing that this bill does is it sets out a definition for what the male sex means and what female sex means, and it provides no area in between. And obviously, because these people don't know what they're doing, the definitions aren't even like super coherent. But then it also goes into some detail about what it wants that to mean for restrooms and housing accommodations in some certain circumstances. Yeah, which is why I was not super excited about calling this the bathroom bill, which is kind of how it got labeled and reported on during the session, because this is not like HB 608, which passed and got signed into law today. Actually, the governor signed it. It is not like, if you remember kind of the headlines from 10 years ago about bathroom bills, like all those did was say trans people can't use bathrooms, go pee in the yard, whatever, right? But this one doesn't just say that. It also does the sex definition part. And the sex definition part is the much larger and scarier part of that, because what it actually does is it goes in, and in every law, regulation, rule, and policy in the state, it inserts these new sex definitions. And at no point in the process of this bill's passage through committees, through the House floor, through the Senate floor, at any point, was there any discussion about what that means, right? So I looked. And so I've had some. It's been a rough couple years to be a trans activist, especially in the South, and so I've not always been kind of on my toes like I should be. But when I kind of pulled out of a funk a few weeks ago and then looked around to the session and saw where we were, I saw that this bill, we had not explained kind of the full breadth of what it does, and I noticed that it had not picked up a fiscal note. In Louisiana, theoretically, if a bill is going to cost more than $100,000 to implement, it's supposed to either get hit with a fiscal note that explains what those costs are, or it's supposed to be dual referred to kind of the subject matter committee, but also a financial related committee. So like Ways and Means in the House, or Senate Finance in the Senate. And that hadn't happened with this bill, right? And so if you go back and look at the VODs and talk about it like it's esports, look at the VODs, you can see like all of the discussion about this bill is just about bathrooms. Like just like most queer bills in Louisiana, all of the discussion is about where trans women pee. And when we used to run our INDA, Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and other bills here, we would make the decision to let one of the trans men present the bills, even though I was our policy person, because if I presented it, all they would talk about on the committee was where I was going to pee, right? It's like this is a recurring problem, and it was just wild to me, because I knew that, because I've done this work in other states, and so I know that in other states, just the bathroom portion, and I got hit with a huge fiscal note in Montana, and Louisiana has 4 times the population of Montana, right? So the idea that this bill would cost $0 to implement is bonkers, because at no point did anyone even talk about how many laws mention the term sex or gender, how many regulations mention those terms, how many employees will need to be retrained, how many policies will need to be written. That stuff doesn't happen for free. And so
millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah,
that's not
exactly.
Even considered.
And so it was they'd passed it out of its committee, so it was going to be on the Senate floor. And I had just kind of wised up and found the Adderall shortage is still there, but I'd gotten some Adderall at that point, so I was able to be a little more effective. And so I kind of assembled a team, just like in the Italian Job or something, pulled people in for one last job, and we worked overnight. We wrote up this it's not perfect, but it's pretty well done for being done overnight with a lot of stimulants. Memo on kind of all of the ramifications and implications that this has beyond bathrooms, and then all of the costs. And we got some actual economists to do kind of napkin math projections for how much it would be likely to cost just, I believe, the Department of Corrections, the Department of Education. It was a lot of money, like over $10 million. And so we had this memo.
You said corrections and what else?
Education.
Yeah,
were the
schools.
two
Oh my
departments.
God, there's so much gender-based stuff in schools.
Right. And so I had there had already been at that point a little bit of fracturing between the House and the Senate in terms of there'd been some other legislation where the Senate was like, oh, the House didn't really do their job. They just kind of sent us this unrefined slop and expect us to fix it and move with it. And so there was a little bit of friction there that I thought we had an opportunity to exploit, right? And so it's very, very hard to get people, even Democrats, get legislators, even Democrats in Louisiana, to take a firm, strong public stance in support of trans people. But in my experience, what is not necessarily nearly as hard to do is get people to take a firm, strong public stance in support of responsible spending of the public's money. Right? And so we had this whole memo.
It's much more important to them than trans people.
Oh, yes, clearly. So we had this whole memo, which I'm fairly proud of, backed up with this reasonable napkin math from actual economists. I'm not an economist, but I know economists. And so I had a friend drive me to the Capitol, and she had to drive because I was still finishing the memo.
You're still writing. You're on your laptop, just typing away.
And so Peyton from Louisiana Trans Advocates and Sarah Jane from Forum for Equality, and then myself and another trans friend, one of my economists, my pocket economists, headed up, and we spent all day lobbying senators, giving them all of the ammunition they need to call out basically the House, call the House legislators, irresponsible fiscally. We can't believe you did procedure wrong. You need to tell us what this cost, all the kind of stuff that lobbyists do, without having to take a public stance in support of trans people, right? And everybody, sorry.
No, just to do and everything, but it's it's slightly comedic. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, you're not wrong. This stuff is funny.
It's effed up, but it's hilarious.
Yeah, right. And so I gave them everything they needed to just re-refer the bill to Senate Finance or something, right? Just to get somebody to take a look at it and have to explain how much it costs, what all these things are, what's going to happen. Because the state has a million agencies and programs, and they're all directed to adjust their regulations and policies to account for these definitions, and nobody talked about it at all. And so everybody we talked to was appropriately angry. They were like, I can't believe that. Why would they send? I can't believe they didn't do their job. I can't believe this is not right. And so actually, everybody we talked to was that way in private, and then we actually worked closely with one particular Democrat, who gave us the impression, and this is not the first time in my life I've been lied to my face by politicians, and it's not anybody listening, I'm sure, has also had this experience or a similar experience of being lied to by politicians, right? But was working with this one Democrat who was very, very on board, super understood it, and even talked with me directly about, okay, if this doesn't work, what then? And I was like, well, if that didn't work, I would do these two amendment options, and kind of the amendments that I suggested and that he agreed would work and be good were to basically limit the bill to the restroom stuff that it enumerates, right? So that the bill does the things that everybody talked about the bill doing and wouldn't do the other stuff, the whole rest of the sex definition stuff, because it has like a notwithstanding clause that is a nuclear bomb for trans people. So get rid of that, and it just does the bathrooms, fine. And you still don't even have to say, take a public stance in support of trans people. You can just say you're in support of responsible government and like the House not being feral and public money stuff. And so at this guy's specific request, wrote these amendments for him. They're on the floor, gave them to him, and then the bill came up for floor debate, and that Democrat just got up and talked about trans bathrooms again, and not even well, just poorly. And so I thought we had a really good shot. I put our chances. People thought we were going to, we had 0% chance of stopping this bill, and kind of up until the bill came up on the floor. I do this professionally, and I don't know what that's worth, but I felt we had like a 60% chance of actually getting it at least, referred back to Senate Finance or something like that.
They'll refer something to another committee like that all the time too.
Right, and that was so easy. I handed it to them on a silver platter to do that, and they wouldn't do it. So I do not know what exactly happened. But I don't think it was. This whole thing kicked off because you mentioned vibes. I don't think it was vibes. I think that there were some Landry pressure or some kind of deal about not making noise about this stuff or what. I don't know. But it was incredibly disappointing for me. And I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've done it all over the country. And that is, I think, probably the most offensive treatment I've ever experienced at the hand of a theoretically allied legislator.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's really harrowing and an awful story, and it sounds like you worked really hard to get again the bathroom to be the compromise, and they still got thrown under the bus. Oh my God. I
mean, when I gave them the amendments, you have to, because I've done this thing before where I theory craft amendments out with people, and I'm like, do not, these are a last resort, do not do these. And then they introduce them first thing. And I'm like, no, don't do that. So, I give them the amendments and with the capital letters above, do not, whatever. They didn't even bother. They just didn't even, just bathrooms, only talking about bathrooms, not even well.
That's a rough one. That is a rough one. Oh my God. But I do appreciate you telling that story, because it does give our listeners a sort of really good insight into how a lot of this stuff does go down at the Capitol. I've seen this stuff. I don't want to talk about it for my work because it's not appropriate. But when you literally, they're gonna be in there with their intention of doing what it is, and they're just looking for a reason to. I remember, this is a funny one. We were at the Capitol years ago, and this is who Polly Thomas is. She's just an absolute clown show. But we were pushing for a raise or something like that for teachers, and we were doing it and doing the notes and all these other things, and it's just I was thinking about giving teachers a raise, but you were just very rude to me or something. It's just okay. Yeah, that's what it's about. Okay,
right.
Yeah.
And I've had legislators tell me to my face before, look, I want to vote with you, but I've gotten 50 calls from Louisiana Family Forum, and I've gotten 10 calls from your people. I need at least an equal number of calls for cover to vote for you.
But then your phones zap them and they don't change anyway.
Right. But, yeah.
Yeah, it's, I don't know. I can't stand it. Can't stand them.
No. It's, And I don't even prefer the lobbying part of my. I much prefer the creative policy drafting and analysis part than the actual having to deal with these sleazeballs part. But I will if I have to, and I often have to. If you're a sleazeball listening to this, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that.
Yeah, no offense to the sleazeballs out
right.
there. When it comes to the policy part, I mean, especially when it comes to states obviously you mentioned, the defensive side of, oh God, we have this horrible bill that's going to define all of these things that are not only going to mess, people like you individually, but also thousands, tens of thousands. I don't know how many trans people, non-binary people there are in Louisiana, but it's not a small number.
Right.
There's implications of all of them that are going to be hit with that, not to mention all of the financial other things. And so you're essentially in a position where you have to, play defense to stop this kind of stuff. When it comes to any kind of like moving things forward, especially in a time like this, what does that even look like? Is that something that exists really, or is it just like
it's something that exists,
like
but it is not something that is resourced, right? It never has been. The minuscule resources that are available to the Deep South for this kind of work are almost entirely tied up in doing the defense, right? And so the kind of proactive thing.
Are you talking about national resources, like national organizations that do the kind of work, or just like putting in a defense here, or is it just like, and it goes to other states to move the ball forward? Or,
Yeah. So I'm talking about the national orgs that that support state LGBTQ orgs during session. Those resources are generally tied to playing defense, and then also just so they're the only consistently paid position for doing queer advocacy work in Louisiana. There's one of them. It's that Forum for Equality, and Louisiana Trans Advocates last year started paying one person for the first time in LTA's entire history. I'm not sure if we're still doing that, if we still have enough money to do that or not, but it's tenuous is what I'm saying, right? And like I had to leave the state for a while to get paid to do this kind of work. And so there just is not on the part. So if you're like an institutional funder, if you are, I actually don't want to name any of the foundations, I don't want to get anybody in trouble or whatever, but if you're one of the large institutional funders that fund groups that do this kind of work, you get these very top line, very 30,000 foot kind of reports that say, these are the attacks, and these are where they're spreading. This is what's happening. And then you direct you fire up your other grant program people or whatever, and like, we got to stop these attacks. We're part of the movement. And so then you create a grant for defending trans people in states in the South or whatever. But it is almost always limited in time scale. So it's hard to, get consistent Gen Ops funding, for example. And then it is primarily devoted to stopping X or Y or Z. And so very, very, it's hard to have kind of the breathing room, the space to think creatively, to think broadly and proactively, and to be able to survive and pay your rent and food long enough to be able to kind of move that kind of stuff forward. That's the kind of stuff that I find the most engaging and I think the most useful for my community. And so one of the things I'm actually working on right now is trying to convene a bunch of our repro and abortion policy people to think through what kinds of proactive policies can we work towards with and I think some of these I think have a decent shot. We have a decent shot of getting passed potentially if we like kind of pull together and push for them, and they don't look like they're coming from us, to try to mitigate some of the worst effects of the really, really harsh myth and miso criminalization law. And so I think there's room specifically in kind of the areas of surveillance and in like firewalling, maybe where speed camera and license plate camera data can go and be easily accessed within law enforcement or other parts of state government. If these drugs are going to be added into the PMP, if there's any room for kind of doing more regulation around who can access the PMP and when and for what reasons. And those are all things that you can present in ways that some conservatives find a lot more acceptable than if you're saying we need to do this to protect people's healthcare access or whatever. You're like, oh, this is government overreach, big surveillance, 1984, get scared, whatever. Then you can, then you have a little room there. Just like saying we're doing the syringe exchange authorization to reduce needle sticks to cops. Like, yes, it does do that, but it has maybe some more benefits than that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that really does sound like you have to. I mean, like you said, you have to think creatively, and I'm just sort of like, yeah, you have to find justification. It's almost like speaking like politicianese, like you're speaking a
Mm-hmm.
language that these people will be responsive to. Like you're talking like, I mean, I don't want to be unfair to children because children are much more emotionally intelligent and like empathetic than a lot of
Yeah.
these people. But like you have to talk to them in a language that they would respond to in a way that you would like, and that's not an easy thing to do
Yeah.
because their motivations are not like
Yeah.
you say oh, if they get wind of the idea that this might help somebody
Hmm.
somewhere, that's like
It's
hold on
actually
a
kind of
second.
it's really just kind of just the natural inverse of what it takes to be a good policy analyst. Like if you have anxiety, if you catastrophize things constantly in your head, get into policy because you'll be really good at it, right? Because if you like, all it takes to be a good policy analyst is to read this language and then like let your brain come up with all the terrible things it could
All the
mean,
horrible
because that's what it means, right? And so if you can do that in reverse and think of like, what are all of the weird good things that I could say about this? If you can train your brain not just do the catastrophizing in one direction, but also like the reverse catastrophizing in the other direction, you've got
oh my
all the
god,
bases covered.
reverse catastrophizing. I think we have an episode title.
Yeah.
I guess as we sort of wind down in our last couple of minutes, where can so if you wanted to sort of like say like in the next couple of years or whatever, like what is something to be possibly like hopeful for to in the midst of this hellscape that we face, or something that we can sort of encourage people to be fighting for or to get with. You mentioned, I mean, the fact that that there is a sort of necessity of you know coalescing around and using institutional knowledge from previous struggles. If you wanted to sort of like say what are the next couple of, I guess, important things to focus on for the next few years, especially in the midst of this Landry administration, what would those things be?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I'd love for folks to take away from this is to organize, to talk with your neighbors, to learn what they're dealing with, what their concerns are, compare them with yours, and come together to brainstorm with other people ways to address everyone's needs, right? Whether that is policy advocacy, whether that is creating mutual aid structures or practical support structures, whether it is just like making sure, for example, in the harm reduction world, that your friends know that you are a safe person to talk to about drug usage, so that they know that they don't have to use alone. If they're using a new fresh batch, they can maybe text you to check in on them every few minutes just to make sure they're okay. To spread Narcan around your community, right? I think especially in the South and especially in Louisiana with what we're facing, we always have relied on each other. Louisiana's strongest resource, I think, is its people. It's not our oil or whatever, right? Like
It's
it's
not the thing
always
that's killing all of us. It's the thing. It's
right.
actually us.
And now, yeah, now we're shoving all this carbon under Lake Maurepas to create a Godzilla there. That'll be fun.
That'd be
But
awesome.
yeah, it is like we are going to need each other even more than we always have. And so, don't just post or don't just listen, but actually get out there in your community and make those connections, because those connections are what are going to keep us safe and alive for the next few years.
Well said. Where can people find you and get more
So I am at Gay Narcan on Twitter, and then
I love that. I love that.
I can't believe it was still available when I made this Twitter account 2 years ago or whatever. And then I would also encourage folks to check out Louisiana Trans Advocates, latransadvocates.org, the statewide trans organization that I used to run and still organize with, doing great work here in the state. A trans femme collective that I'm a part of also just recently launched the Trans Income Project, transincomeproject.org, which is direct cash transfers to Louisiana trans sex workers. And then We are also very
Give trans sex workers your money.
Yes, that is the pitch. And then we are also self-funding a tech startup, weirdly enough. If you do bill tracking and analysis for long enough, you develop very strong opinions about what that software should have in it. And so you're welcome to check that out. The full site is not up, but our dev blog is up at blog.openpolicy.forum.
Corinne Green, thank you so much for coming on Good Morning Comrade. And thank you, everyone, for listening. You want to say something?
No, just thank you so much for having me. This was a great discussion.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Like I said, follow Corinne at Gay Narcan. Follow me at Eminent Prof on Twitter for my stupid opinions. And you are listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. We love you. Bye-bye.